introduce our first speaker, Barbara Holdrege, in a few words. Barbara Holdrege is a professor in the Department of Religious Studies in the University of California, Santa Barbara. She is a comparative historian of religions, specializing in South Asian and Jewish traditions. She published many books. I will only mention her recent book with the title Bhakti and Embodiment, Fashioning Divine Bodies and Devotional Bodies in Krishna Bhakti. I think it appeared in 2012 in London, Routledge, or... Oh, excuse me. So I tried to find out, but... okay.
A little more light.
So,
Can you turn that on?
please,
okay.
before our speaker starts, I would like to request you to make your handy phone silent, and please be during the lecture silent. Otherwise, it's extremely difficult for the speaker. Thank you very much, and I request Professor Holdrege now to start the lecture.
Okay, maybe. I'm not sure. Maybe I won't. I think maybe not. Okay. Turn it on, turn it off, yeah? Okay. And yes? Ready? That's good. Okay. It's a great delight to be here, and I thank so many people. I'll just mention a few: Ravi Gupta, Kenneth Valpy, the Department of Philosophy at the University of Madras, the C.P. Ramaswamy Iyer Institute of Indological Research, the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies, and all the other sponsors. I'll leave it there. And thank you for bringing together this amazing array of scholars from India, Japan, Israel, Europe, America, and maybe I've left some others out, but the rest of the world. Thank you. The Bhagavata Purana is the consummate textual monument to Vaishnava bhakti traditions, which is generally held to have originated in the Tamil region of South India between the 8th and 10th centuries of the Common Era. This preeminent Vaishnava text provides a robust example of the scripturalizing strategies by means of which a popular devotional text that originated outside of the Brahmanical Sanskritic tradition succeeded in achieving canonical status, not only within Vaishnava bhakti traditions, but also within the orthodox Brahmanical canon of Shastras. In my paper today, I will interrogate the mechanisms of scripturalizing at work in the social life of the Bhagavata Purana, which involve a complex interplay between the countervailing dynamics of Sanskritizing and vedacizing practices on the one hand, and vernacularizing practices on the other. As we move from the discursive practices of Sanskritization and vedacization to the countervailing practices of vernacularization, we move from the world of the text to the text in the world, and from the scripturalizing of texts to the scripturalizing of humans. The case of the Bhagavata Purana illustrates the mechanisms through which local and regional vernacular traditions that derive from the popular power matrix are Sanskritized and incorporated into the corpus of translocal, pan-Indian Sanskritic texts promulgated by the Brahmanical elite. The scripturalizing of the Bhagavata Purana involves Sanskritizing the vernacular Tamil devotional traditions of the Alvars by incorporating their devotional teachings along with North Indian ideologies into a Sanskrit text that adopted the canonical form of a Purana. Freedom Hardy, in his landmark study of the early history of Krishna devotion in South India, has argued persuasively that the Bhagavata Purana is, in his words, an attempt to render in Sanskrit, and that means to make available for the whole of India the religion of the Alvars. Regarding the Bhagavata's role in Sanskritizing the Tamil bhakti of the Alvars and contributing to the synthesis of North Indian and South Indian traditions, Hardy remarks, these are his words, the period from about the 6th to the 10th century in the Tamil South is characterized by a very fertile and multifarious encounter between two cultures, Tamil and Sanskritic Hindu. The Bhagavata Purana is an attempt to harmonize the various complexes involved in this encounter and to resolve the tensions it had given rise to. Northern culture oriented itself by a social system, with the Brahmins as the foremost varna, and an ideology, the Vedanta, while Southern culture was characterized by the emotional religion of the Alvars and by great aesthetic sensibility. The Bhagavata Purana tries to integrate all four complexes, and it uses the symbol of the Vedas to achieve this while adopting the Puranic literary form. So this is Freedom Hardy. The Bhagavata Purana was successful in achieving canonical status within both Orthodox Brahmanical traditions and Vaishnava Bhakti traditions as the most popular and influential of the 18 Puranas in the Brahmanical canon, as one of the most important scriptures in the Vaishnava canon. This Sanskritization of popular Krishna devotional traditions in the form of the Bhagavata Purana made it possible for these regional vernacular traditions to be carried as part of the pan-Indian Sanskritic tradition from South India to North India, and provided one of the catalysts for the development of Krishna Bhakti movements in North India. The Bhagavata itself soon became established as the authoritative scripture of Krishna Bhakti that is celebrated to this day as one of the most cherished sacred texts among the general populace of North India. The Bhagavata invests its teachings with the canonical authority of Shastra and secures for itself a place within the Brahmanical Sanskritic canon, not only by adopting the canonical form of a Purana, but also by assimilating itself to the paradigmatic canonical category of Veda. The process of Sanskritization thus involves a more complex process of vedacization, in which the Bhagavata Purana deploys a variety of strategies. First, to establish its canonical status as Purana Veda, a status that it shares with other Puranas. And second, to claim for itself the transcendent authority of Krishna Veda, the Veda that is identical with Krishna, and that is the culminating scripture of the entire Brahmanical canon. In attempting to assimilate itself to the Veda, the Bhagavata Purana exemplifies a well-documented phenomenon in Indian history, whereby any Hindu text or teaching seeking to legitimate its authority had to do so with reference to the Veda. As J.C. Hasterman emphasizes in his words, the crux of the matter is that the Vedas hold the key to ultimate legitimation. Therefore, even if the Vedas are in no way related to the ways of human life and society, one is still forced to come to terms with them. Whether the Veda is revered or rejected, appropriated or subverted, it remains a symbol invested with authoritative power that must be contended with by all those who wish to position themselves in relationship to the Brahmanical hierarchy. Legitimating function of the Veda derives from its role as a transcendent source of authority, in which the core Shruti texts, the Vedic mantras collected in the Samhitas, are ascribed the status of transcendent knowledge. Any subsequent text can participate in that status only by assimilating itself to the Vedic mantras through a range of strategies. Through this process of vedacization, the domain of Veda has been extended beyond the circumscribed boundaries of the Vedic mantras to include not only an expanded array of Brahmanical Sanskritic texts, but also a variety of vernacular texts derived from non-Brahmanical origins. The Bhagavata Purana makes use of a variety of strategies to invest its devotional teachings with the transcendent authority of the Veda. In contrast to the highly circumscribed Vedic Samhitas, this popular bhakti text is intended to inspire and edify the general populace, and thus provides an alternative means for marginalized groups to participate in the eternal reality of Veda as embodied in the Krishna Veda. First, in terms of language, the Bhagavata Purana regularly makes use of Vedic archaisms, employing Vedic grammatical forms and vocabulary in an attempt to imitate the language of the Vedas. Second, in terms of content, Vedic material is incorporated throughout the text, with the exception of the 10th book, which celebrates the life of Krishna. Frederick Smith notes that, in his words, the Purana, taken as a whole, is saturated with references to Vedic deities, sages, rituals, and myths. Third, in terms of self-representations, the Bhagavata Purana adopts the common Puranic strategy of simply asserting its identity with the Veda. For example, the Bhagavata claims for itself the status of the fifth Veda alongside the four Vedic Samhitas, Rig, Yajur, Sama, and Atharva, that constitute the core Vedic texts. Moreover, it asserts that it is equal to the Veda and the essence of the Veda, and it proclaims itself the ripe fruit of the wish-fulfilling tree of Veda that is full of ambrosial nectar, amrita. Finally, the Bhagavata goes even further and claims for itself the consummate status of the Karshna Veda, that is the embodiment of Krishna, the Supreme Godhead, and the concentrated essence of the entire Brahmanical canon of Shastras. The Bhagavata Purana gives expression to a new type of aesthetic, passionate, and ecstatic Krishna bhakti that is rooted in the vernacular Tamil traditions of the Alvars, supported by the popular power matrix. And the processes of Sanskritization and vedacization served as a means of legitimating and promulgating the Bhagavata's innovative devotional teachings by incorporating them within a Sanskritic framework invested with the pan-Indian canonical authority of a vedacized Purana. Through this strategic appropriation of the discursive practices of Sanskritization and vedacization, the exponents of Krishna Bhakti sought to position their devotional teachings in relation to the Brahmanical elite, while at the same time they developed vernacularizing practices through which they sought to reclaim the Bhagavata for the popular power matrix from which its devotional teachings originally derived. The text of the Bhagavata itself, while at times seeking to emulate the paradigmatic Veda, at other times counters this vedacizing impulse and engages in an incipient vernacularizing process that provides a socially inclusive model of scripture that diverges from the Vedic model in significant ways. First, in contrast to the Vedic Samhitas, which may be recited and heard only by male members of the three twice-born Varnas, Brahmins, Kshatriyas, and Vaishyas, the Bhagavata asserts that it may be recited and heard by people at all levels of the socio-religious hierarchy, including traditionally excluded others, such as Shudras and women. Second, the Bhagavata Purana emphasizes not only the power of mantra, but the power of sacred narrative as well. In contrast to the sacramental efficacy ascribed to recitation of the Vedic Samhitas, which focus almost exclusively on shabda, verbatim reproduction of the Vedic sounds, the Bhagavata is invested with a didactic function in which both shabda and artha, sound and meaning, are important. For the discursive content of the text is intended to convey important devotional teachings and practices to the general populace. Third, this vernacularizing model of scripture entails a shift in modes of scriptural transmission, in which the Bhagavata Purana departs from the Vedic paradigm of exclusively oral transmission by emphasizing the importance of both written and oral modes of transmission that do not require the mediation of Brahmin priests. The Bhagavata, in its written visual manifestation as a concrete book, is revered as a text incarnation of Krishna, which functions as a special kind of murti, or ritual image, that is to be venerated. A practice that is particularly cherished by subalterns who are illiterate and thus have no means of engaging the written text beyond ritual veneration of the book itself as an icon. Although this incipient vernacularizing is aimed at refounding scripture, a major problem still exists. The text is in Sanskrit, the language of the religious elite, which means that the vast majority of the Indian populace who do not know Sanskrit have historically been excluded from direct access to the text itself. However, the explosion of popular Krishna bhakti in the 16th century catalyzed the development of vernacularizing strategies in the form of oral, performative modes of re-signification, by means of which people at all levels of the social-religious hierarchy can appropriate, engage, experience, that mark the lila stalas, the sites of his playful exploits. Among the earliest known religious authorities to visit Braj and perform pilgrimages in the area are seminal figures in two of the Vaishnava, most important Vaishnava sampradayas, Chaitanya, who inspired the establishment of the Gaudiya Sampradaya, and Vallabha, the founder of the Vallabha Sampradaya or Pushtimarga. Chaitanya and Vallabha subsequently directed their followers, the early Gaudiya authorities known as the six Gosvamis of Vrindavana, and the leaders of the Pushtimarga, to carry out the reclamation of Braj by identifying certain locations within the region with specific events from Krishna's youth that have been recorded in the narratives of his life found in the Bhagavata Purana and other authoritative scriptures. Having rediscovered the lost Leela Stalas, where particular episodes of Krishna Leela, divine play, are held to have occurred, the leaders of the Gaudiya Sampradaya, Pushtimarga, and other Vaishnava schools then established temples and shrines to visibly mark these sites as tirthas, sacred sites. This mapping of authoritative scriptural narratives onto specific geographic locales occurred throughout Braj and resulted in the scripturalizing of the entire landscape, transforming the geographic region into a place of pilgrimage. David Haberman, in his study of contemporary pilgrimage in Braj, remarks regarding this process of reclamation, in Haberman's words, whether the developments of the 16th century were a reclamation or amounted to a new creation, vast amounts of work went into the cultural construction of Braj. These developments can be viewed as a process of externalization. That is, in the 16th century, a world that had existed primarily as an interior world, described in Vaishnava scriptures and realized in meditation, blossomed into an exterior world of material forms, and this culture was expressed physically. The 16th century was a time of a great coming out party in which the material forms of Braj culture were uncovered and revealed. In this regard, the activities of Braj in the 16th century provide us with a rare glimpse into a process where myth directly influences history. David Haberman. The reclamation of Braj in the 16th century, then, provides us with a glimpse more specifically of the process of scripturalization through which Braj was transformed from a mythic space represented in the narratives of the Bhagavata Purana as a setting for Krishna's Leela into a place of pilgrimage encompassing myriad tirthas marking the Leela Stalas, the specific sites of the divine cowherd's playful exploits. From the end of the 16th century to the present day, hundreds of thousands of pilgrims from all regions of India and all socioeconomic classes have traveled each year to Braj to track the footprints of Krishna in the scripturalized landscape, and to recall the stories of his useful exploits from the Bhagavata Purana that are indelibly associated with this place. Pilgrims come from all over India each year to perform the Banyatra, circumambulating the 168-mile pilgrimage circuit that encircles the entire region of Braj. After inaugurating their pilgrimage with a ritual bath in the sacred waters of the Yamuna, they traditionally embark on the parikrama path with bare feet, as a sign of their reverence for the dust that has been consecrated by the feet of Krishna. As part of the Banyatra, the full circumambulation of Braj, which generally lasts from 1 to 2 months, they may also traverse the 3 smaller pilgrimage circuits within the encompassing circuit, circumambulating the city of Mathura, Mount Govardhan, and the town of Vrindavan, as they reach each of these central nodes along the Banyatra path. As pilgrims and local residents journey through the scripturalized landscape of Braj, on which the narratives of the Bhagavata Purana have been mapped, their own bodies become scripturalized as they engage the Bhagavata through a variety of oral performative modes. They engage Krishna's living presence in the oral text through hearing formal Sanskrit recitations of the Bhagavata Purana by qualified Brahmin reciters as part of the daily service in local temples, and also through attending public performances of Bhagavata Saptaha, in which all 12 books of the Bhagavata are ritually recited from beginning to end over the course of 7 days. The Bhagavata Purana is not only revered as a body of efficacious sounds that, when recited, manifest Krishna's presence among the listeners, it's also extolled as a wellspring of multi-layered meanings that, when expounded, serve to illuminate the nature of the Supreme Godhead and his Leela. Temples in Braj occasionally sponsor 7-day Bhagavata celebrations that combine Bhagavata Saptaha, which 108 Brahmins recite together 1/7 of the text each morning, and Saptaha Katha, in which a learned Bhagavata scholar delivers a discourse on the recited portion of the Bhagavata each afternoon or evening, expounding the meaning of the Sanskrit in a vernacular language appropriate for the particular audience. In addition to these oral modes of reception, worshippers in Braj also engage the Bhagavata in its written visual form by ritually venerating the concrete book, which is enshrined in a number of local temples as a special kind of murti. Worshippers in Braj internalize the language world of the Bhagavata, not only through hearing formal recitations of the Sanskrit text and vernacular discourses expounding its meanings. Beyond the confines of temple spaces and the mediation of Brahmin priests, they also engage the Bhagavata through Lila Shravana, hearing the Bhagavata stories of the divine play sung in the vernacular by Kirtana groups as they progress along the pilgrimage paths of Braj. Moreover, the worshippers themselves directly engage the Bhagavata through Nama Sankirtana, communal singing of the divine names of Krishna, recorded in the text, and Leela Kirtana, singing their own vernacular versions of the Bhagavata's narratives about Krishna's Leela. During the monsoon season every year, thousands of pilgrims travel to Braj from all over India to participate in Krishna's Leela, not only through Leela Shravana and Leela Kirtana, hearing and singing the Bhagavata stories, but also through seeing these stories enacted in dramatic performances called Rasa Leelas. As Jack Hawley has discussed in his extended studies of Rasa Leela performances, the Rasa Leela is traditionally performed by Rasa Leela troupes in which young Brahmin boys native to Braj enact the roles of Krishna, his consort Radha, his cowmaiden lovers, his cowherd friends, and other characters in Krishna's Leela. As soon as the central actors don their crowns as Krishna and Radha and the performance commences, they are revered during the duration of the performance as Svarupas, living forms of the deity and his eternal consort. Through these vernacularizing practices, in the form of oral performative modes of resignification, the bodies of worshippers in Braj are scripturalized inscribed with the language world of the Bhagavata. As they circumambulate the pilgrimage networks and move from Leela Sthala to Leela Sthala, they celebrate the particular episodes of Krishna's Leela recounted in the Bhagavata that are associated with each geographic locale and engage the scripturalized landscape with their scripturalized bodies. They visit the hills, forests, groves, ponds, and other sites where Krishna is said to have unfolded his divine play and left his bodily traces. They revel in Krishna's bodily presence in the sacred terrain of Braj with their own bodies, embracing the ground through full body prostrations, rolling in and adjusting the dust, touching the stones, hugging the trees, bathing in the ponds, engaging with their bodies every part of the landscape consecrated by the body of the divine cowherd. Moreover, as Haberman has emphasized, many contemporary pilgrims and residents of Braj proclaim that Braj is the body of Krishna, echoing the pronouncement of Narayana Bhatta, the 16th century Gaudiya authority who is credited with creating the Banyatra. The ways in which worshippers engage Krishna's corporeal instantiation in the scripturalized landscape of Braj with their scripturalized bodies are vividly illustrated in pilgrimage traditions associated with Mount Govardhan. Krishna is represented in one Leela episode in the Bhagavata Purana, as many will know, as assuming the form of Mount Govardhan, and in his mountain form, consuming the ritual offerings that the cowherds had originally intended for the deity Indra. When Indra unleashed torrential rains to punish the people of Braj for ceasing to worship him, Krishna, in his cowherd form, effortlessly uprooted the mountain and held it aloft with one hand as an umbrella for 7 days in order to protect the cowherds, cow maidens, and cows of Braj from Indra's deluge. Invoking this Bhagavata narrative, many contemporary pilgrims and local residents revere Govardhan as a localized embodiment of Krishna in the form of a mountain. Because they venerate Mount Govardhan as the body of Krishna, they may refuse to set foot on the sacred mountain lest they desecrate the divine body, a tradition that is held to have been established by Chaitanya during his 16th century pilgrimage to Braj. Instead, they circumambulate the mountain by foot, traversing the Govardhan parikrama path in a minimum of 5 to 6 hours if walking at a brisk pace. Some pilgrims and residents of Braj, out of reverence for Krishna's mountain form, circumambulate the mountain in a manner called Dandavat Parikrama, which involves performing a sequence of full body prostrations along the parikrama path, a practice that can take 10 to 12 days if performed along the entire length of the pilgrimage circuit. This practice is particularly prevalent during the festival known as Govardhan Puja or Annakuta, which is celebrated each year on the day after Diwali, the Festival of Lights, in the month of Kartik. As part of the veneration of Mount Govardhan during the festival, pilgrims and local residents traditionally perform Dandavat Parikrama along the Parikrama path until they reach the town of Jatipura at the foot of the mountain. In Jatipura, a great feast is celebrated in which the mountain, as a form of Krishna, is ritually anointed with milk, decorated with auspicious red and yellow powders, and offered a mountain of food. Mount Govardhan's special status as a localized embodiment of Krishna is ascribed not only to the mountain as a whole, but also to each of its stones, or shilas. In contrast to sculpted murtis of Krishna, which are iconic images fashioned by artisans and must be consecrated by Brahmin priests through rites of installation or pratishtha in order to invest the image with the deity's presence, Govardhan shilas are worshipped as natural forms, svarupas of Krishna, and therefore do not require ritual installation mediated by Brahmin priests. These aniconic murtis function as what Owen Lynch calls a metonymic divinity, in that the sacrality of the part, the shila, derives from its special status as the concentrated essence of the whole, Mount Govardhan, which itself is revered as a part that embodies the wholeness of the Supreme Godhead. Govardhanshilas are venerated as living forms of the deity by worshippers at all levels of the social religious hierarchy, subaltern and elite, illiterate and literate, female and male, in public and domestic shrines throughout Braj. With these vernacularizing practices, we move from the world of the text to the text in the world. We move beyond the scripturalizing of text to the scripturalizing of humans and the manifold ways in which subalterns have reclaimed the Bhagavata Purana as their own by internalizing its vibrant language world and engaging with their scripturalized bodies, the deity's bodily presence instantiated in a scripturalized landscape. In a mountain, in stones, in iconic and aniconic murtis, and in the sacralized geography of an entire terrain. Thank you.
Now after each. Yes, we can have it right now. And shall I give the micro?
Thank you very much for your brilliant presentation of Sanskritization and vedacization of Bhagavata Purana. I am curious to know to what extent this vedacization has taken place. Normally, when you speak of Vedism or vedacization, it is not only connecting the text or the tradition to the Vedas or Vedic tradition. It's not only related to Shabda and Arth or sound and meaning, but it is more prominently borrowing some rituals or connecting the rituals to the Vedic tradition. The same you find in Shaivism, where there are certain rituals which are very similar to Vedic ritual. Yes. Also we find in Buddhist tantric texts like Vajrayana, there are a number of rituals which are indirectly connected to the Vedic tradition using the vocabulary of Veda. So I wonder whether this has taken place in the Bhagavata tradition. Do you have any wisdom there in Bhagavata tradition?
Well, I'm not sure if I fully understood your question, but what reminds me, and you're talking about the rituals. So for me, the Bhagavata, the idea, the Bhagavata Saptaha, the 7-day recitation of the Bhagavata by 108 Brahmin priests, there you have, right? The Brahman is, in a sense, of Brahmanization of the ritual associated with the Bhagavata. I mean, it's a Sanskritic text, but then it's also accompanied by, in many cases, the vernacular discourse, a discourse in the vernacular. So the meaning, the artha comes along with the shabda. But I mean, I think that you see, I was thinking in another case, a totally different text, but the Ramcharitmanas in Benares, in Varanasi, where you have initially a vernacular text, and that then becomes, in a sense, in certain contexts in Benares, taken over by certain Brahmin priests where they have a ritual recitation with 108 priests, and it becomes, the ritual is a Vedacization, not just, is that what you're getting at there? The actual Vedic rituals are incorporated into a originally was not considered a, strictly speaking, Vedic text. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, okay. Can we have the next question, Dr. Okita?
Holdrege, good morning. Thank
Good
you very
morning.
much for your presentation. I might have misheard, but did you say that not only Chaitanya followers, but then also Vallabhites participated in the excavation of the Braj? Is that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. That Vallabha has said do have. I mean, the traditional understanding is that Vallabha also instructed his followers to recover some of the lost sites. Yes.
Oh,
that
I
is the
see.
tradition.
I didn't know that, and then I was just curious, like how like did they work together, or like I mean, because essentially they were excavating more or less same place. So how do they?
It was a complex negotiation.
I see.
I don't think they worked together. I mean, there are different sites that were claimed, more by the Vallabha traditions, other by the Gaudiyas, and
But they're doing it around the same time.
roughly, I mean, the 16th century, Yeah, I mean, I can't pinpoint exactly. I mean, you have certainly the different Goswamins of Vrindavana going at different times, right? Rupa Goswamin and Sanatana Goswamin establishing their temples, and then Jiva Goswamin later. So you have, and Gopala Bhatta Goswamin establishing temples and shrines at various places. And the Vallabha tradition, the details of that I've not been as focused in on, but it definitely was happening, but different sites are being claimed. And there is some competition in some cases.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barbara, for a wonderful presentation. Did you say earlier that it was not in the 10th book of the Bhagavata where you would find references, Vedic references? Is that, did I hear you correctly?
What I was saying was that all sections of Bhagavata are replete with Vedic references to Vedic deities and Vedic.
Speak in the mic.
Sorry. Okay. All sections of the Bhagavata replete with Vedic references to Vedic deities, rituals. Less references, at least maybe relatively speaking,
Okay.
within this 10th book about Krishna, life of Krishna.
Okay. So
Not that there would be none, of course.
Okay, because
Yeah.
I was becoming a little stressed out when I
No,
heard that.
of course not. Because I mean, I've worked on the Veda,
Yeah.
Karshna Veda. Krishna's.
Okay.
Yeah. No.
Because as you know, in the famous first verse of the Ras Leela, Bhagavan
Sure.
apita ratri. Ratri, as you may remember in my book, I talked about how this is a reference to the Vedic goddess of the night,
Yes.
metaphorically referring to the Vrajagopikas who become goddesses of the night.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
so you haven't ruined my whole thesis.
No,
right?
I haven't.
Oh, thank you very much.
Try not to.
Excellent. Good.
Thank you.
Less references, less. I mean, that's the thing that people find curious. Frederick Smith has made he's emphasized that more. You know, that somehow
Okay.
the 10th book is very distinctive, obviously, from the rest of the Bhagavata.
I see, yeah.
And so he's making the point that on the other
And-
parts
and
of the
it
Bhagavata,
is.
many references.
Right.
Hmm?
And it is indeed. But there are, I think, little
Sure.
remnants, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
I agree.
Good. Thank you.
Last short question.
Very brief intervention. A very brief intervention.
Yes.
I appreciate what you have said, and I go along with what you've said also. And you know, Thomas Hopkins has also written about it, about
Yes,
the social.
exactly.
Yeah. But I would like to also point out, maybe that was what my classmate there for the first question put by him. There is a lot of popularization. That means, you know, the non-de-Brahmanization, put it that way, in the Bhagavata Purana itself.
Yes.
And then also later on. But my point is this, that we could also still critique the present situation. For example, you yourself mentioned that the priests are Brahmin priests, okay? The discourse may be by others. And then the presentation, the leelas that are presented are by Brahmin boys.
Yes.
Brahmin plus boys. They are acting the part of the girls also. So, well, in our modern day, we need to go a little further too.
Yes.
We have made progress, but we need to go a little further. That's what I want to say.
Yes.
Thank you.
You know, part of what you're seeing today is I've done a lot of work. It kind of brings together two aspects of my own work because since I was a graduate student, I've worked on the Bhagavata, the Sanskritic side, the text itself. I love this text. But then more recently, I've worked in Braj and done field work in Braj on the pilgrimage traditions and so on. So in my mind, I'm trying to think, what is the relationship? But you're right. I mean, it's certainly, I can't say across India, but in Braj, it is the case that there's a lot of mediation still by the Brahmin priests, is what you're saying, or by Brahmins. Is that what you're saying there? But you know, but the other thing that struck me though, I mean, I come out, staying in Vrindavan, I come out and the women who live there, the local residents, I mean, you know, every day they go on pilgrimage. I mean, it's very much a place for people from all socioeconomic classes, even if the Brahmins are still mediating certain rituals, the recitation, the discourses. It's a place, to me, that is really open and for possibilities for people from all levels, genders, and so on. Do you agree with that? Do you see what I'm saying? Yeah?
Excuse me, I think we are running out
Okay,
of time.
okay.
I'm very, very sad
Okay,
to break
thank
up
you.
this discussion after this wonderful lecture, and we would like to thank you for this lecture again, please. And I will introduce him. You can already come on the stage. Jack Hawley is a Cleartown Professor of Religion at Barnard College, Columbia University. Jack Hawley has directed Columbia University's directed Columbia University's South Asia Institute. He has received multiple awards. He has been a Guggenheim Fellow and was recently elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. This year he is in India working on a Fulbright Nehru project called The New Vrindavan. He has written and edited some 20 books on Hinduism, the last India's Bhakti tradition and the comparative study of religion. The title of his recent book is A Storm of Songs, India and the Idea of Bhakti Movement, and appeared Harvard 2015. Jack, only one point. If you hear this sign, yes, then you have only, you have 5 minutes. Okay. So, thank you.
I'm not sure what I am, but I'm not an art historian, which means that I don't have command over PowerPoint. I've just been seduced into it by the fact that we have PowerPoint. So let's see if we can actually atta. And maybe we can get onto a, there we go, atta. Is this not the essence of the Bhagavata Purana for you? We'll come to this in a moment. I want to thank the organizers, the many organizers of the conference, and to all of you who are present in the room this morning. Let me just say that the room itself is glorious. It's my first time here. The chance to be in a South Indian house, really, of this kind, which has connections to the Travancore court, is just a remarkable thing, and then surrounded by the library resources of the traditional South. Those of us who spend time in the North, I mean, it was shocking for me to come into Chennai after this many years and to just feel how very different the South remains from the North. Of course, there are many regions of India, but that South-North contrast is a very important one, and it's certainly one that is built into the lore of the Bhagavata itself in the form of the Bhagavata Mahatmya, which has come to, let's say, channelize it in the course of time. So it's a very special thing to be here, and I can't thank Barbara enough for having laid the general landscape for the series of footnotes, really, that I'll be, picky footnotes sometimes, that I'll be adding to this rather glorious story you've presented about the openness. You've presented both sides of it, the Sanskrit element of the text, but then its openness to others. We'll be taking a second look at that from the Braj perspective. And third, let me say that I'm very lucky to be located in Vrindavan this year, which gives me a chance to see, actually, with my own eyes, how very much has changed. You spoke of the month of Shravan, for example. It is no longer the great pilgrimage month of Braj. It's become a year-long and especially weekend-oriented culture. Annakut is no longer celebrated in the way that it was when I was there 40 years ago. There's no one jumping into that pile of rice anymore. So things are just changing at a rate of rapidity in at least that part of India that makes us have to reconsider what we say about what happens in Braj itself. The classic Braj is becoming a landscape of the past. It's becoming a classic thing that is so rapidly in flux that when we speak of it, and I've done this for many years myself, when we speak of it in general terms, we have to be careful to, I would have to be careful to, in relation to my students, if I present the picture, the classic picture of making a parikrama of Vrindavan, today I would have to report that that entire road has been paved now. So you are no longer touching the Braj Ki Raj if you undertake it with your bare feet. This is the India in which some of us live. Okay. Well, now having taken, can we have the bell? Oh no? Okay. I need my other glasses for this. Aged has its tolls. I want to say that I am a guest at this table more than most of you. Some very nice comments were made about the status of a guest in Indian culture, which we appreciate very much, but guests don't always know as much as they should. Though I spent many happy hours years ago in Benares, 40 years ago, studying with Pandit Ambika Datya Upadhyay, and actually reading the Bhagavata Purana with him, sections of it, my approach to the text, the way in which the text makes itself known to me, is primarily from the outside. From the outside, from hearsay, from katha, from translation, and from seeing, as Barbara has suggested, its enormous impact on the religious life of North India over the course of the last 500 years. The Bhagavata Purana is a principal character in a play that has been running for centuries, and it promises to run for many centuries more. But as in many a play, we learn to ask whether this character, the Bhagavata in this instance, whether this character is a discrete character, self-announced and self-determined, as one might expect from the text, what the text says about itself, as Barbara has so nicely pointed out. Does it turn out to be this kind of discrete character, or is its character formed in relationship to other characters who are on stage for this centuries-long running drama? And what are those other characters? In short, as we watch this play, this lila of the Bhagavata through history, are we seeing the history of a text moving through history, or are we seeing the ways in which history, with all of its complications, actually gives us a sense for the character of the text itself by the time we get to the end of the play? And folks, we're never going to get to the end of the play. We're only here in the year 2017, just short of Vaikunta Ekadashi, in this particular year. Who knows what the Bhagavata will be in what section of India or the world 50 years from now? Consider the canonical Bhagavata, however, of the present moment, the edition published by Gita Press, Gorakhpur, and read throughout the world. I didn't make this up. I did write a book on Krishna as a butter thief, but I did not say anything to anyone about why the butter thief should be represented as the image of the Bhagavata. I hope some of those of you who are steeped in the text will be deeply offended by the fact that this is the image of the Bhagavata that we see put before us by Gita Press, at least in this year. It's not just that the edition you may use could have a Hindi or an English translation come with it, or a series of illustrations, internal commentary to the text, but the text itself has been powerfully elided with the Bhagavata Mahatmya, which inevitably appears at the beginning of the Gita Press text. It is bound into the Bhagavata Purana as if it were, in some way, the introduction to the text. Yes, it's carefully marked from the text, but the reader is invited to approach the text, the larger text, the Purana, through this particular Mahatmya. In Vrindavan, at least, standard practice in the delivery of a Bhagavad Katha requires that a good bit of time be spent in the first day expositing the Mahatmya as against the Bhagavata itself, and sometimes it comes into the seventh day of performance as well. Nor is this entirely inappropriate. After all, the Mahatmya actually does build on features that develop in the parent text. The characters, there's that word again, the characters of jnana, vairagya, and bhakti, which take on hypostatic form in the Mahatmya, are based on principal themes in the Bhagavata itself. Also, and I'm thinking of Dan's presentation to us yesterday, also, the parent text proceeds with plenty of framing devices. We saw Parikshit and Shukdev in conversation with one each other. Those framing devices then are carried forward in the Mahatmya also as it is constructed. Still, I do think that if we are to try to explain why the Bhagavata Mahatmya, this Bhagavata Mahatmya, was written at the point in time when it was, I believe, written, we have to take into account a rather less romantic and generally organic view of the development of the Bhagavata text as generating its own principles of interpretation. The earliest manuscripts, at least that I have been able to locate. And once again, I want to indicate my debt to Madras University and to the staff of the Catalogus Catalogorum, that wonderful institution at the university where we were yesterday, as providing the basic resources for being able to answer these questions about the history of a text as we can learn it through manuscript production in India. The earliest texts, with one exception, of the Bhagavata Mahatmya date to the years, and this is the Christian or Gregorian calendar, 1714. And you can see that there is an enormous explosion, you could say, of texts that happens between 1714 and 1734, with 3 of them actually being written in a given year, 1724. There is one exception to this rule. That is a text which is in the Vrindavan Research Library, which claims a much earlier date. You can see it over in the right-hand corner. A date that has lots of problems with it. First of all, it makes no sense in terms of the other manuscripts that appear. There seems to have been a little bit of overwriting. The nature of the making of the 5 doesn't correspond to the 5 as we find it elsewhere in the manuscript and so forth. So I'm going to set that one aside as an earlier text that I think doesn't accurately represent the actual production of the text, but rather what someone wished it might have been. So we have to ask ourselves then, why is it that in northern and northwestern India, at a particular point in time, at least to judge by the places in which these manuscripts are retained, why do we have this particular text being written? You'll notice that the places do include many. Can you notice that anymore? No, but I can help you. There we are. Somewhat. Isn't this a beautiful slide? I hope, Niraja, that you're terribly embarrassed to be associated with anyone who would show a slide like this. You know, you can just see me putting these papers together on a desk and trying to figure out how I can take an iPhone photo of it, and then, oh, it's just a mess. But here we are. You have some results in any case. You can see that these texts are held in places like Baroda and Jaipur and Jodhpur and Natwar and Kota, quite a number of Vallabhite names there, as well as the British Library. God forbid we should ever forget the British Library. And that they seem to have emerged more or less at the same point in time. Why and who? You may think that a name like Kota suggests the Vallabh Sampradaya, and indeed, and the word Brahma Sambandh, which is actually crucial to the Vallabhites, does occur in the text, but in a form that doesn't match its ritual usage in the Vallabh Sampradaya itself. Furthermore, as those of you who know the text would know, it focuses on Vrindavan, and while what Barbara has said in general, I'm sure, is true about the shaping of Vrindavan in the mind of the 16th century, these 2 Sampradayas, I think Vallabha himself was not involved in this process at all. I think we have to look to his son Vittalnath, but the point stands that the Sampradaya is definitely involved in its production. So Vrindavan and so forth, it's a sort of Vrindavan that we might imagine if we were reading Chaitanya texts. So the text itself seems to oscillate between, or not to fall actually in the orbit of either of these Sampradayas, perhaps more Chaitanya than not. Thinking of the work of Filioza on this subject. So what is it? It seems to take a more comprehensive view. How shall we place it? What I would argue, after I have a little drink of water, I hope you see who you're seeing here. Here we have Narada speaking with Bhakti, whom he discovers by the river. And here are her poor sons, Vairagya and Jnana, all represented in a very South Indian form. I happen to love this illustration, which I pulled after very, very hard work, pulled straight off of the net for your enjoying pleasure. How shall we place, then, this text at its moment in time in the early 18th century, or perhaps it existed in some form in the late 17th? Why? I'm going to skip details because I know time is running away. I have written this out in the Storm of Songs and in an article. My general sense is that this was a community of North Indian Brahmins who had some connection to, or believed they had some connection to the south, and particularly to the southwest. We see that the Tungabhadra appears in this account. Whether they are actual transplants to the north or not, I do not know. But my suspicion is that we see here a text which is very anxious about the fact anxious about all the good things that Barbara was trying to persuade us about what was happening in the 16th and 17th century in North India, namely the accessibility of the Krishna tradition to many people. More specifically, the accessibility of the Bhagavata itself to different populations of people. We have a number of general, so we know that the Leela tradition, the Ras Leela tradition of the Braj region was alive, functioning, and very powerful in those days. But we also know that the Bhagavata itself, the Sanskrit text, was being translated, was being rendered into vernacular languages at a huge speed, comparatively speaking, at that point in time. So that we have the great text that Neeraja has worked on. 1686, we have the Bhupati rendering of the Bhagavata into Brajbhasha. We have Nandadas going to work on the text. We have Eknath over there in Banaras working it into Marathi. So an enormous amount of stuff going on. Worst of all, however, from the point of view, I think, of the writer of this text, is the fact of who is doing this work. If we look at one of the earliest texts, it comes to us in Brajbhasha from a man called Lalach Halwai. Okay, Lalach Halwai. So his family comes from a family of sweet producers, Halwai. He is a kayast. And his Haricharat, which he abandons at a certain point, is then finished by another kayast who is eager to complete the text for whatever audience you might imagine in Brajbhasha. And he's not the only one. We have, where did I write it down? Oh, yes. There is a man in Gujarati named Keshav Kayast who composed a Krishna Krida Kavya in the late 15th century. And we have also a man by the name of Asanand. Well, this is the person who actually completed the Lalach test, also a Kayast. So what I think is going on here is that a group of Brahmins in North or Northwest India is very concerned about the elaboration of this text and its being claimed as being available to and interpretable by other people than Brahmins. Hence, what do you get in the Bhagavata Purana itself? You have a report of 2 performances of the Bhagavata itself and of its restorative properties, and the second one is even more sort of punctilious and detailed than the first. Not just in the preparation of the person who is going to be doing the recitation, he must of course be Brahmin and all those things, and he must be surrounded by 5 other Brahmins who chant the mantra, the Vaishnava mantra, sort of to protect him from whatever influences might come in from the outside that would seem to work against it. So he is surrounded, and then the people who undertake the vrat, which enables them to participate in this ceremony, who must they be? Let me just give you one verse. 649, in the English translation provided by Gita Press. He who has taken the aforesaid vow, that's to say, of listening to a 7-day performance, the aforesaid vow should not speak to a woman in menstruation. There goes the accessibility of the text to all women. He should not speak, he's a he to start with. He should not speak to a member of the lowest classes, nor to a mlecha, like me, nor to an apostate, a pakandi, nor to a member of the twice-born classes who has not been invested with the sacred thread, though grown to a mature age, someone who is a dvija but has not lived out the life of a dvija, properly speaking. We should not speak with a Brahmin hater, certainly not, or anyone who is outside the pale of Vedic religion. So you get the picture. This is a text that is eager to relocate, to reclaim the Bhagavata as a Brahmin text that will belong to those who have some kind of connections to the South, and certainly not to these people who are busy propagating the Bhagavata in the general world. Or at least that would be my hypothesis. The text itself has some unkind things to say about malechas, specifically about yavanas, and I wonder if that may not be important. Just think of who these kayasts were working for, largely speaking. Sometimes for a Hindu ruler, let us say, but very often for a Muslim ruler. That's part of the inner story of Rupa Goswami, actually. But the kayasts, so that I think probably stand for that kind of, what should we say, miscegenation of the text that the author of the Mahatmya is trying to work against. So, in one way, I think it's important for us to appreciate the fact that, I mean, you could ask, well, what is this? Are we seeing Sanskritization or are we seeing vernacularization? I think from the point of view of the Mahatmya, we have to see this as Sanskritization in a very strong sense. But it's Sanskritization, I would propose, that is necessary because of the vernacularization of the text in some of its forms, whether directly in the form of translation and representation in Brajbhasha and Avati, or in the form of its being played, so to speak, by other groups. So that would be one way of looking at this text in relation to the issue of borders. I would say that the Bhagavata Purana, the Bhagavata Mahatmya, is a border policeman, is trying to control the borders beyond which the Bhagavata must not go if it is to remain the sacred text that, let's see this in positive terms, that we have received from many centuries before. Now let me just, Marcus, how much time do I have? 10 minutes?
Still time for you. Go on. 15 minutes.
15, oh my.
Minutes. 12 minutes.
Okay. I hope you recognize Surdas. Here he is, not in the Wikipedia form, which has reversed the picture, but in the older illustration from Brajbhasha and Sons, Mathura, and then Mumbai. So, who is this Surdas? If you read a popular introduction to Surdas, you will read that he is a translator of the Bhagavata Purana. Yes, and in fact, we can turn. Does this actually show? Oh, good. If you turn to the Nagari Pratarani Sabha edition of the Sursagar, which was published finally in its complete form in 1948, you may well find a poem such as this one. I would need my other glasses to read it out to you. Let's give this a try. Shri Mukha, that would be the mouth of Vishnu. Shri Mukha, Chari Shloka Diye Brahma Kon. Sorry about that. Samjhay. Brahma Narada Son Kahe, Narada Vyasa Sunai. Vyasa Kahe Sukadeva Son. Dwadasa Skanda Banai. Surdas Soy Kahe Padabhasha Kari Gai. Oh, there it is. There it is textualized for you. And this is not the only poem. Surdas is the inheritor of a very long tradition that takes us back right into the origination of the Bhagavata itself, and in fact, to the mouth of Vishnu himself. Great. But the problem is that this poem is nowhere to be found in any of the old, let's say 15th and 16th and 17th century manuscripts of the Sursagar. Quite to the contrary, I believe it has been created for the Sursagar at a later point so that the Sursagar can be read as a vernacular translation, so to speak, or at least version of the Bhagavata Purana. If you turn to the earlier manuscripts of Surdas, and we do now have, thank goodness, the Murthy Library edition of this, so you can look at it. It's easily affordable in both countries around the world. You will see that none of the old manuscripts of the Sursagar actually is patterned after the Bhagavata. The issue of Surs being remade as a translator of the Bhagavata is an issue of the 18th century. There's more to be said about this, but let me just show you one manuscript that I have come to love. It's archived at Bharat Kala Bhavan in Banaras. And this is the first page of the manuscript. It is a long manuscript, incomplete, of the Sursagar, actually of the 10th book, which begins, this is the first page, with, whom do we see here being fanned? Not the Krishna you expect, but in fact Rama. So the patron of this manuscript, which goes on to display the glories of Krishna, especially in his childhood forms, 10th book, the moment of his birth, Vasudeva's taking him for refuge to the other side of the river, and these disturbing scenes that show him stealing butter and then stealing something quite different that has something to do with butter. These are all part of the ambience of this particular mid-18th century text. Why mid-18th century? Because its closest textual correspondence to a dated text, which we have, tie it to a mid-18th century text, and also because, as I've been given to understand, the forming of the images makes that likely as well. As for the Nagarjuna edition, the manuscripts they relied upon principally were ones in their own collection dated 1790, Christian era 1793. So the end of the 18th century is the basic text of the Bhagavata, of the Sursagar, of the Sursagar that you get if you read the Nagarjuna edition. The earlier form of the Sursagar is quite different. And now, this is the second page of the manuscript, and this is the one I hope you will love the most. Here you see who? Here you see Shukdev speaking with Parikshit. Fascinating. This is the beginning of a Sursagar manuscript, but we are somehow to understand already that this has something indelibly to do with the Bhagavata, even though it can't be justified by the text itself until it got to its 18th century moment. And this carries on into this 1812, into the Lucknowi tradition derived from actually the Mughal court, where we have a representation this time of Surdas actually expounding his own text, apparently. You see him there on the bottom, accompanied by Radha and Krishna in the main dais area, and then all of the gods. And I would love to know exactly who he is addressing. Neeraja, maybe we can talk about this later. Dan. So it's a tradition of the Bhagavatizing of the Sursagar that continues, as we can see from a sort of art historical point of view, continues actually in the productions of first the Mughal court and then the Lucknow court, the court of the Nawab of Awadh. And I'm wondering whether the I want to say Islamic sense of what a text is part of the driving force for the way in which the Sursagar comes to be figured as a text, as a connected text in this very importantly Mughalized and then post-Mughalized environment. It's not at all the kind of text production that you would want to see if you were the people who were sitting there creating the Bhagavata Mahatmya at the beginning of the 18th century. I'll end by showing you my favorite new friend. My favorite new friend is a set of illustrations. We can speak about it as a manuscript, but Dan's caveat to this point is very important. They are actually a collection of pages. I think there were originally 50 of them. Why? Because on page 50, as on page 1, it represents itself as a Sursagar. And in one intermediate page, you're seeing just any old page here. It's rather toward the end. But, so how can we date this? That's what I'm hoping to learn from Dan and Neeraja tomorrow evening. But for the present purposes, let me just say that the style of mustache that came to be celebrated in the period of Rana Amar Singh II in Udaipur around 1700, those mustaches do occur in this manuscript. So it's hard to think that it could have been earlier than that, and perhaps that's about the right time. This is from the Met, quite a different tradition, which is very specifically associated with Amar Singh. You can see his mustache there. So I'm not going to show you the mustache pages. That's not the point here. The point is to say, here we see, I think, it's the first example I have seen of a Sursagar that is represented not so much as a Bhagavata, but as the Sursagar which we have come to know and love, namely the telling of the childhood of Krishna, and not, for heaven's sake, not the Indra or the Govardhan moment. This is the Krishna who, we're celebrating his feet here. This is the first page, and if you look at that representation of Trivikram at the top, you'll see that on page 50, which I wish I knew its current location of. If anyone knows, please tell me. On page 50, the last page, we see a return explicitly to this feet of Vishnu theme, and the Trivikram motif is turned as if on a bookend at the end of the manuscript. And then in the intervening pages, we have quite some attention to those very feet. So here we see the Sursagar being represented as a bounded text, though they're separate pages, a bounded text, 50 pages, I'm not sure who it was created for, maybe a member of the Zanana, hard to know, and focusing on these beautiful feet. How did these feet learn to walk? It's a beautiful representation of, where a text starts, what's the focus of a text. It's an effort to create a focus for a text that is rather distributed otherwise. And I think, could be wrong, I think this is rather separate from a Bhagavata vision of what the Sursagar would be like. I hope you like those feet. So now I've shown you my favorite recent manuscript. I just wanted you to think about here's another vision of the Sursagar which has nothing to do, at the beginning of the 18th century, which has nothing to do really with this Bhagavatizing of that document later in the century. And now finally, let me just show you a slide or two from Vrindavan today. These are Bhagavad Kathas that I've been present in the course of the last 2 months. Very interesting thing. Here's a traditional performer. And here's another one, and it's a she. She is one of the younger members of a Bhagavata reciting family who began her talk by apologizing to all of the scholars of Vrindavan, specifically for the fact that she was taking this role, cited her own lineage in terms of her father as a Bhagavata performer. I think it's very important that we are seeing now the opening of the Bhagavata text to the recitations of women. Here's another example from one of the hoardings in Vrindavan that I've seen in the course of the last week, and here is a third. So you might say, aha, at last we have that kind of open to women sense of the Bhagavata that we've learned to appreciate from the kinds of things that Barbara has said. Good, maybe the text itself is a sort of impetus to that opening of the text to others. But I would point out that at least in what I've been able to see, all of these women are very definitely Brahmins. I don't see Kayasthas reciting the text, whether it be an akhandapat of it or an exposition of it. This is Brahmin terrain. So I don't know what you think about this butter thief as a representation of the true nature of the Bhagavata. We don't see too much of his feet there, so it doesn't exactly correspond to my favorite Sursagar of the moment. But I do think it makes us ask about the pliability, the openness of the text. The very fact that the editor, I'd love to know the process by which this illustration came to be on the cover page of the Gita Press Bhagavata. Were they hoping that Anpadalok might feel attracted to the text by seeing the butter thief? And you can find your butter thief in there. Maybe so. But as a representation of the text itself, it shows us something about the grinding of gears that we have to deal with in looking at the long history of this text in Indian civilization. Thank you.
Thank you.
I was going to suggest you could just come up here and I'll go down there. That would be much better.
No, but Jack, I really enjoyed the way you present. Your delivery is perfect.
Thank you.
Very entertaining. Thank you so much for an enlightening paper.
Thank you.
But,
Did you hear that butt?
I just want to make a comment. There's this, sorry to make a division between a Western approach and an Eastern approach. There's a you want a reason for everything. Why should this particular thing come on the front page? We would rather say it's just yadrichaya. It just appeals to somebody, they put it up there. You see, so why should there be this quest always to find a reason behind everything? You see, that it kept bothering. And just one more comment, there is hope because women, it's been opened up for women now. And just as the Gita now has many male non-Brahmin preachers, a time will come when there will be many non-Brahmin and even others. I mean, it's sort of uniformly being preached by everyone, whoever has the appeal. You know,
Thank you very much. I had indeed wanted to say in the beginning that the Bhagavata Purana we will know in 50 years, in whatever location in the world we are, is sure to look different from today. I'm not going to apologize for looking for reasons. I think there's a, tarka and artha and even shabda. These are disciplines that are just as based, and you could even say more rigorously based in India than any place else. So you think the Purana tradition should be free from all of this Brahmanizing worry. But that's what I think we saw happening in the Bhagavata Mahatmya. Someone, for a reason, got very worried, I think, about the way in which this text should be performed, and therefore tried to establish or at least propagate a template which may not have been following. Well, it's me looking for reasons, and I admit it's definitely circumstantial. We can't establish it from the text itself, except that it shows that it's worried. It shows that it's worried about the mixing of sampradayas, and I think that stands in for the mixing of lines of authority taken from the past, and certainly is worried about the fact that Malechas have control over the tirthasthanas. So I take those as invitations to look at the social context out of which the text itself was created.
Thank you. It was delightful, as usual, to hear you. I have a question. I've looked quite closely at the Bhagavata Mahatmya from other perspectives, and there is I don't have the exact text here, but there is, in a paraphrase, there are a couple of verses in the Ananda Ashrama Sanskrit edition, which may be different. I mean, it's different from the Venkateshwar edition, which is translated in Gita Press. But there are a couple of verses that talk about how Shudras and women, Shudras, okay, let me do it again. In the Ananda Ashrama Sanskrit edition of the Bhagavata Mahatmya, there are a couple of verses that talk about how Shudras, women, and others who were excluded from participating in Vedic yagyas are invited to participate in the Saptaha yagya, not by themselves reciting, but by hearing. And I'm not sure, I'd have to go back and see if those verses are not in the Gita Press edition. Did you not come across any verses
I'm not
like
sure
that?
either. I'm just sort of quickly reviewing it for today. I didn't meet them, but they could well be there.
Yeah, I'll look and check that and let you know.
Yeah, and
Because it was very specific, and it was interesting because it was talking about, this is the Saptaha Yagya, which in a way supersedes Vedic Yagyas, and in that way it's open and it's more accessible. So there's this other aspect perhaps within it.
which we would expect, I suppose,
Yeah.
in any sort of classic text. But to me, the general shaping, and this is hardly the only instance from that crucial sixth book, that they are so worried that it's,
Yes,
you heard it by yourself. So thank you very much. I will look for it. Thanks.
okay. I have given you the first.
One more question? Okay. If not, then next speaker, Dr. Gupta, Ravi Gupta. Fine. So you can come on the stage. Studies and serves as director of the Religious Studies program at Utah State University. He has received 3 teaching awards, a National Endowment for the Humanities Summer Fellowship, and 2 research fellowships at Oxford. He is a permanent research fellow of the Oxford Center of Hindu Studies and past president of the Society for Hindu-Christian Studies. He is author and editor of 4 books, including an abridged translation of the Bhagavata Purana, together with Kenneth Valpy. And this is published this year by Columbia University Press. So, thank you that you are here, and I request you to start your paper.
Thank you. I have to first of all thank Marcus for doing such a great job in chairing this session, keeping all of us on time and fielding all the questions. Definitely following Barbara and Jack is a huge task. I don't have any beautiful pictures to show you, so I'm going to read my paper. But I do have a good story to tell you, and I hope that will make up for the absence of paintings. So Here we go. The title of my talk is Restoring Sight to Blinding Love, the Bhagavata Purana's transformation of the Urvashi Pururavas narrative. The narrative of King Pururavas and the heavenly damsel Urvashi is one of the oldest love stories in the world, with a staying power that few others can claim. The account of their love, separation, and in most versions, their eventual reunion has been retold and reinvented throughout Sanskrit literature, from the Rig Veda to the Mahabharata and many Puranas, to the extraordinary rendition by Kalidasa and beyond. As with the stories of Vritra and Vishnu Trivikrama, it seems as though any self-respecting Puranic storyteller has to include the story of Urvashi and Pururavas within his repertoire, whether the story fits that repertoire or not. The attention given to the Urvashi Pururavas narrative in the Bhagavata Purana is surprising, given that the story has no obvious Vaishnava elements. Pururavas is mentioned in 4 books of the Bhagavata and in an astonishing 8 chapters, 2 of which offer extended treatments of the story. One might argue that the Bhagavata Purana's attention to the Pururavas story is merely an example of the Puranic habit of repeating important narratives. The Puranas, whether they be Vaishnava, Shaiva, or Shakta, perpetuate a shared body of sacred lore, retelling similar narratives that are adapted as needed for a particular audience or sectarian tradition. Such reasoning, however, is distinctly unsatisfying as an explanation for the Bhagavata's interest in and transformation of the Pururavas story. The Bhagavata Purana is not one to mimic other Puranas merely for the sake of conformity. Indeed, the Bhagavata is hardly an exemplar of the Puranic genre, for it possesses qualities that make it unique amongst the Puranas: systematic philosophical reflection, elegant poetic expression akin to kavya, a variety of longer meters, difficult vocabulary, and grammatical forms that are self-consciously Vedic, all things I have had the privilege of struggling with for the past several years in trying to translate portions of the text. Perhaps the Bhagavata's most distinctive attribute is its tightly woven narrative structure, which allows little that does not serve its relentlessly focused message of bhakti. As I have argued elsewhere, the Bhagavata's dialogues are highly structured and student-driven. The student's question serves not merely as a prompt that sends the speaker on a long and winding journey. Rather, each question leads to a carefully circumscribed response, after which the speaker returns to his student, reaffirms the latter's question, and requests confirmation that the answer has been satisfactory. Even when the answer requires narrating a multi-chapter story, rarely does the speaker get carried away in the kinds of digressions that are common in, say, the Mahabharata or the Padma Purana. Indeed, even when the Bhagavata Purana retells an old story, rarely does it settle for familiar modes of storytelling. As C. Mackenzie Brown has shown with the Bhagavata's Vritra narrative, and Deborah Seufer has shown with Narasimha, the Bhagavata tells Puranic stories only to transform them in the service of its primary message, that devotion to Vishnu trumps all other considerations of dharma and social status. The examples are endless. Kings exert power over brahmanas, as in the account of King Ambarisha and the sage Durvasa. Animals invoke the Lord's appearance, as in the story of Gajendra the elephant. Demons demonstrate the highest devotion, as in the demon king Bali's self-surrender to Vamana, the dwarf avatara. Wives are elevated over their husbands, as in the Brahmanis who humble their husbands by their selfless devotion to Krishna, and an unchaste woman like Pingala becomes a wise teacher. Perhaps the most often cited example is the gopis, the cowherd women of Vraja, whom the Purana holds up as exemplars of bhakti, as they steal away from their homes and husbands to dance with Krishna. Even so, it is difficult to see how the romance of Urvashi and Pururavas might serve the Bhagavata's purpose. none of the major Puranic deities, Vishnu, Shiva, or Devi, play a significant role in the love story, and neither Pururavas nor Urvashi are famous for their devotion or dharmic heroism. There are no significant social role reversals of the kind described above, unless one were to count the not unusual occurrence of a celestial damsel falling for a mortal king. The Bhagavata could have easily ignored the story of Urvashi and Pururavas, as it does the story of Nala and Damayanti, for example, or it might have provided an abbreviated and routine version of the story, as it does for the romance between Prince Agnidhra and the Apsaras Purvachitti. Instead, the Bhagavata offers an extended and innovative rendition of the Pururava story across 2 chapters in 2 books. Why? The primary account of Pururavas, son of Ila, occurs in chapter 19 of book 9, where we hear a version of the story that more or less follows the storyline of the Shatapatha Brahmana and the Vishnu Purana. Urvashi descends to earth as a result of a curse. We don't hear the reason for the curse in the Bhagavata, and is enchanted by Pururava's beauty. The feeling is mutual, and Urvashi agrees to be his wife with the following conditions. Pururavas will always protect her 2 pet lambs, feed his wife only ghee, and never show himself nude except during intercourse. The eager king agrees, and the couple enjoy one another's company for many years. Indra, however, feels keenly Urvashi's absence and asks the celestial Gandharvas to bring her back to heaven. The Gandharvas steal the lambs at night, and Urvashi laments loudly, calling her husband a coward and questioning his masculinity. Stabbed by her words, Pururavas jumps out of bed naked and pursues the Gandharvas. They release the lambs but shine brightly, and Urvashi sees Pururavas naked. The marriage condition has been broken, and Urvashi disappears in a flash. Pururavas wanders the world madly searching for his wife, and eventually finds her along with 5 of her girlfriends at Kurukshetra. This is a place of a reunion in the Bhagavata, in the 10th book, Krishna and the gopis as well. The dialogue that ensues recalls the Rig Veda, 10th Mandala, chapter 95, beginning with the king petitioning his wife, "My beloved, wait a while, let us talk." Pururavas insists that he will die, his body eaten by wolves, if Urvashi does not return, and Urvashi implores him to preserve his life, again reminding him that he is a man. She explains that women are merciless, like wolves, and friendship with them does not last. Nevertheless, she promises to spend 1 night a year with her husband and informs him that she is pregnant. Pururavas returns after a year, spends a night with Urvashi, and takes home his son. But before Pururavas departs, Urvashi advises him to propitiate the Gandharvas so that they might give her back to him. The Gandharvas are pleased by the king's worship, and they give him a fire vessel to perform sacrifice, by which the king eventually attains the realm of the Gandharvas and is reunited with his beloved Urvashi. Before Pururavas performs the sacrifice that gets him back Urvashi, there's a twist in the story. The king abandons the fire vessel in a forest on his way home. Many versions of the story have attempted to explain why Pururavas would abandon the fire vessel, his promised means of regaining Urvashi, only to later attempt to retrieve it. The Bhagavata offers a unique explanation. When he received the fire vessel, the king, blinded by love, thought he had received the brilliant Urvashi herself, only to later recognize that it was only a fire. Feeling either disappointed or betrayed, he abandons the vessel. As Pururavas pines for Urvashi, the Krita Yuga, the Satya Yuga, the first cosmic age, comes to a close, and the second age, Treta, begins. This new era is the age of sacrifice, and thus the knowledge of Vedic ritual arises spontaneously in Pururavas' heart. He soon realizes that the Gandharva's fire vessel was indeed the means for sacrifice, that would allow him to rejoin his wife. When he returns to the forest, he discovers that the fire vessel has turned into 2 trees, and using the wood from the trees, he performs a sacrifice to Vishnu and succeeds in attaining the world of the Gandharvas and being reunited with Urvashi. Now, we can make several observations right away. Pururavas is the grandson of the moon, Soma, and thus his story is foundational for the establishment of the lunar dynasty, one of the 2 royal lines in which most Puranic heroes are born. In particular, the lunar dynasty is the family in which the Bhagavata's most important protagonist, Krishna, is born. Pururavas is also regarded as a founding ancestor by the Pandyan kings, who would have been important to Vaishnavas living along the Tamraparni. Finally, his story has a crucial cosmological dimension. As we have seen, Pururavas is the first human being to discover the methods and results of Vedic sacrificial ritual, thanks to a gift from the Gandharvas, and thus he is instrumental to the transition of ages from Satya to Treta. This could be why the Bhagavata counts Pururavas in Book 2 among a select group of about 50 men and women who know Vishnu's elusive power, Yogamaya. The passage of cosmic time is a key concern for any Purana, and the Bhagavata is no exception. Nevertheless, while these dynastic and cosmic reasons may account for the presence of Pururava's story in the Bhagavata, they do not explain why the Bhagavata counterintuitively chooses to depict Pururavas and his father Buddha in a rather unflattering light, or why the text returns to the story again in Book 11, as we shall see, to transform Pururavas into a renouncer devotee. Indeed, the Bhagavata finds the story's traditional happily ever after ending deeply unsettling, for it goes against the Purana's central message. Temporal, sensual pleasure is ultimately a source of suffering for the self, who can be satisfied only by cultivating bhakti for Krishna. No doubt, the Bhagavata depicts bhakti as amorous and deeply passionate. Take, for example, the rapturous love between Krishna and the unmarried gopis, or the pain of separation between Rama and Sita, or the ecstatic devotion of Prahlada for Vishnu. But the Bhagavata takes care to distinguish this devotional love from worldly attachments that serve only to perpetuate bondage in the cycle of rebirth. And so we should note that the Bhagavata's narration of Urvashi and Pururava's separation lacks the characteristic features of its other love poetry. Absent are the beautiful long meters that depict the gopis pining for Krishna, or the extended pause in an otherwise brief narrative to describe Rama's agony of separation from Sita, or the lush retelling of Kardama and Devahuti's passionate play. The Bhagavata treats the Pururava story with marked disinterest, retelling the account as a matter of Puranic duty, until, that is, we arrive at the Aila Gita, Pururava's song in Book 11. It is in this innovation that the Bhagavata shows its true colors, finding its distinctive voice in an ancient narrative. The Aila Gita occurs within Krishna's dialogue with Uddhava that comprises much of Book 11 and arguably constitutes one of the Bhagavata's most widely cited dialogues. While teaching Uddhava, Krishna narrates a few Gitas, all with the same theme: songs of renunciation sung by those who have experienced worldly pleasure and seen its futility. In Book 11, chapter 23, for example, we meet the Avanti Brahmana who loses his wealth, property, and family only to find peace in the life of an itinerant mendicant. We hear the lament of the prostitute Pingala, who comes to realize that the pleasure she desires from money and men, who are no more than sacks of blood and bones, can only be found in love for Vishnu. And we hear Bhumi, the earth herself, sing in bemused tones about the kings who have come and gone through history, each making futile attempts to rule over her. The Aila Gita thus forms part of a genre of Gitas, songs of renunciation, that occur near the end of the Bhagavata. When we meet Pururavas again in Book 11, he is in Urvashi's world, reunited with his beloved. But now his heart is in a different place. He reflects on his endless desires and how they have led him to expand his life in the pursuit of temporary pleasures. Pururavas vacillates between blaming his heartless wife and blaming himself, ultimately concluding that the body is not a worthy object of attachment, repeating the same tropes of renunciation for women as Pingala did for men. At the end of Pururava's soliloquy, Krishna explains the moral of the story. The surest path to liberation is keeping company with Krishna's devotees. As for King Pururavas, Krishna tells us, quote, singing loudly the song in this way, Pururavas, the king of kings, left the realm of Urvashi. He realized me as his own self and reveling in the bliss of the Atman, went about all over the world. Pururavas, the renouncer, surely this is anathema to a story that is the paradigmatic love affair in Sanskrit literature. Yet, despite the apparent disjunction with earlier narratives, I would argue that the opposite is true. The Bhagavata is deeply engaged with the earlier tradition, particularly the Rig Vedic narrative, and sensitive to the themes found therein. The Rig Veda's tragic ending, with Pururavas left pining for Urvashi, provides rich interpretive material for the Bhagavata, and is far more suitable to its aims than the happy endings of other Puranas. Jameson and Brereton point out that, quote, no subsequent version of the Pururava story can tolerate the radical portrait of the emotionally detached Urvashi found in the Rig Veda. While this is certainly true of the Bhagavata's main retelling in Book 9, the Purana returns to, quote, the hard edges of the Rig Vedic Urvashi in the Aila Gita, as Pururavas recalls her heartless rejection. A linguistic comparison of the Bhagavata's verses with those of Rig Veda, Mandala 10, chapter 95, demonstrates that the former is clearly aware of the latter. And at least in 3 instances, the Bhagavata directly references the Vedic text. But more interesting for our purposes are the ways in which the Bhagavata teases out the theological potential present in the Vedic version and reinterprets its motifs. The sacrificial fire, fed with oblations of ghee, that will transport Pururavas to heaven, in the Rig Veda, 1095-18, becomes the insatiable fire of desire that, although fed by the nectar of Urvashi's lips, is never satiated. The wolves of separation that threaten to devour Pururavas in the Rig Veda become Pururavas' own uncontrolled senses in the Bhagavata. His nakedness is no longer a sign of the deception he suffered, but a confirmation of his irrational infatuation. The Bhagavata seizes Urvashi's statement in Rig Veda, quote, I knowing instructed you on that very day, but you did not listen to me, and transforms her into a wise teacher who understands the temporality of worldly love and instructs Pururavas to give up that desire. I remain totally confused, says Pururavas in the Bhagavata, despite being enlightened by her eloquent Vedic speech. So how can I blame her? Urvashi's criticism of women's infidelity in the Rig Veda is rolled into standard tropes of renunciation by the Bhagavata. And finally, Pururavas' mad search for Urvashi now resonates with his wanderings as a renouncer who has quieted his passions. His plea to his wife to stay and talk is now undermined by his own determination to keep moving. But perhaps the most revealing indicator of the Bhagavata's dependence upon and reinterpretation of the Rig Vedic account appears when we examine the final verse of chapter 95 in the 10th mandala of the Rig Veda. Pururavas has just professed his desire for Urvashi one last time, and the Rig Vedic poem ends with a final statement to the king. I quote, "Thus these gods here say to you, Aila, as it turned out this way, you have a bond to death. Your progeny will sacrifice to the gods with an oblation, but you will rejoice in heaven. It is this verse, I would argue, that contains the motivation for the Bhagavata's Aila Gita, for it betrays the key components of Pururava's song in the Bhagavata. Listen to the translation again. Thus, these gods here say to you, Aila, as it turned out this way, you have a bond to death. Your progeny will sacrifice to the gods with an oblation, but you will rejoice in heaven. First, we ought to notice that the voice and tone of this final verse in the Rig Vedic account. The gods are offering a prognosis for the king's future. Gone are the petitions and posturing, the arguments and the blackmailing. This is a simple statement from a senior to a junior in the way that only a god or a teacher could speak. The Bhagavata's Aila Gita carries this tone, a sense that the king has been jarred into seeing his predicament, that he has been taught by someone else, perhaps by Urvashi, as the king indicates, or by another. Indeed, right after the Aila Gita, Krishna explains the song's moral, namely that every person should seek out the company of virtuous people from whom one might hear and learn. Second, the Rig Vedic verse begins with the rather stark statement, you have a bond to death, which Carl Geldner has read as a warning to Pururavas. This prediction of death is particularly surprising in the Rig Veda, given the fact that Urvashi has just implored Pururavas not to die. And it reinforces the sense that this verse stands apart from the main dialogue. Temporality and human mortality, as we have already seen, are consistent themes in the Aila Gita, which stands apart from the Bhagavata's main narrative in Book 9. In effect, the Rig Veda's final verse offers the Bhagavata an opportunity to sing a new song. Third, there is the apparent blessing at the end. You will rejoice in heaven. This statement is irresistible to a theologically minded interpreter as a reference to ultimate liberation, particularly in the context of the Bhagavata, where liberation is conceived as participation in the eternal play of Vishnu in Vaikuntha. After all, if this is a place where Pururavas will be truly joyful, the Bhagavata might argue, what else could it be but moksha? That quest for liberation and its eventual fulfillment is the story told by the Aila Gita. Finally, we ought to note the epithet used to address the king in the last verse of Rig Veda, 10th Mandala, chapter 95, Aila, son of Ila. Throughout chapter 95, the king is called Pururavas, but here again, the final verse is different. The Bhagavata also switches names in the Aila Gita. The main narrative in Book 9 uses a variety of epithets, Pururavas, Mahamanas, Purusha Shrestha, and numerous words for king. But in Book 11, he is Aila, son of Ila. There is thus little doubt that the Bhagavata Purana has an eye to the Rig Vedic story, particularly its final verse, which it mines for theological content that is consistent with the Purana's own message. In the process, the Bhagavata molds the Pururava story into a second chance narrative, a type of storyline that is central to the Bhagavata structure. Second chance narratives are the stories of accomplished kings, sages, or devotees who stumble on the path to liberation, usually due to desire or attachment, but after experiencing a lifetime of enjoyment, regain their determination and achieve final success. There are many such accounts in the Bhagavata. Take, for example, the pious Brahmana Ajamila, who falls for a prostitute and leads a sensuous life, only to realize his folly after undergoing a frightening near-death experience in his old age. We might recall King Bharata, who renounces his kingdom and heads to the forest, only to become attached to a deer. When he dies thinking of the animal, he is reborn as a deer, but with full memory of his folly. In his third life, he regains a human body, focuses his mind on Vishnu, and attains perfection. There are other examples, the sage Sobhari, the king Chitraketu, and the elephant Gajendra, to name but a few. Pururavas then, becomes the final instance of a stumble and recovery motif in the Bhagavata. The love between Pururavas and Urvashi is well and good from the Purana's perspective, but when Urvashi leaves the king, he should have taken the opportunity to walk the path of renunciation, like other kings of the past. Pururavas' laborious attempts to regain Urvashi are a sign of his maddening attachment, argues the Bhagavata, and his rise to Urvashi's world becomes instead his downfall. Nevertheless, Pururavas soon realizes the folly of endless attachment, sings the Aila Gita, and walks the path of renunciation. And this, for the Bhagavata, is the real happily ever after ending to the world's oldest love story. Thank you.
Minutes before a break.
The theme and practice of renunciation and indulgence. I think one important theme is attachment and renunciation, and the transformation that happens in this rendering. Now, there is also a view that there is an intertwinement of attachment and renunciation in the Vedic tradition itself. So, it is in that context then that even in the original Vedic conception, if there is a simultaneous entwinement of renunciation and attachment, if there is, therefore, to look at the whole story as well as transformation from this concern of the simultaneous, relationship between attachment, and renunciation. And if if we read the Vedic story itself, whether there is any moment of awakening in that point of view, even in the moments of indulgence.
As far as I can tell, I don't see a moment of awakening in the Rigvedic account, except for this very suggestive final verse that I mentioned, where it's not Pururava speaking or Urvashi, but a narrator who comes onto the stage and tries to end the story in a rather abrupt way. We're left in the Rigveda, in terms of the storyline, we're left with Pururavas merely pining for Urvashi and she standing her ground and saying, we can never be together again. And I think it's that moment of final heartbreak that the Bhagavata seizes upon and says, we can turn this into a renouncer narrative and we can work this out more clearly. And I think that's where the Bhagavata is turning to the Rigvedic narrative in particular.
In fact, Rigveda does not narrate the whole story of Purava and Urvashi. It contains only the conversation between the two, and it leaves the story incomplete. We don't know how this story ended.
Yes.
Whether it ended with a reunion or ended in separation of the two, etc. And then in Shatpatha Brahmana, etc., this is story of the Haye Jaye, etc. Aise Tishta Ore Vatan Sukit Vishta Pranava Bahai, and then he said Pururaboma Budhoma Pradapta Matavtu Shivasuva Shivasuva Dukasuva Shivasuva, etc.
The story of the Rigveda is certainly incomplete if we read the later accounts into the Rigvedic account. I'm hesitating to do that here because I think if we take the Rigvedic account on its own and don't necessarily postulate the later endings that we find in the Brahmanas onward, I think we have a more fruitful comparison with the Bhagavata. I think the Bhagavata is self-consciously going back to the Rigvedic text. And so it does a disservice to the Bhagavata's version of the story by necessarily completing the story according to the Shatapatha Brahmana or the Vishnu Purana. So I agree that it's fragmented. Definitely the storyline is not entirely spelled out in the Rigveda. That's clear. But I don't think we can necessarily assume that the ending is incomplete, that the Brahmana version of the ending has to be the actual ending that is somehow missing there.
Okay, excuse me, sir. So we have Oh, very short. Two more questions.
Okay, Rav, I'm just curious if the within the Bhagavata, so you pointed out that there are two accounts of this story. If the account in the latter, the 11th book one, says something about the earlier account in the 9th book one, like how does the text itself justify the fact that it has to speak about this story twice? And the related question is that if that the fact that the same story is told twice might suggest the multiple authorship.
The Bhagavata is conscious of the earlier version of the story. I think the connection between them has to do with the Rig Veda again. So both versions of the story reference, both the 9th book and the continuation in the 11th book reference the Rig Vedic text. So they're both looking to the Rig Veda. That provides the strongest bond between them. In terms of narrative, I think the bond has to do with Pururava's himself reflecting on the events that happened in Book 9, talking about his nakedness, for example, and reflecting in embarrassment on what he did and saying, this is clearly a sign that I've lost my mind. So there's that sort of reflectivity that goes back to the 9th book version. The connection lies with Krishna and Uddhava, where they're looking for Krishna's trying to provide illustrative examples of renunciation and kings who have recovered their good sense. But in terms of the multiple authorship question, I can't speculate. I mean, with those two things, there's not enough of a disjunction that I could argue for multiple authorship. There's also not enough of a close tie between them where it would clearly be the work of a single author. So I don't think these two stories make that clear. It might serve as a little piece of evidence as part of a larger argument, but in and of itself, I would hesitate to speculate.
Okay, our last question, very short.
Brilliant presentation, thank you for that. My question is, you suggested that there may have been paintings done. Have you looked at manuscript illuminations with this particular narrative?
I haven't. It's something that would be wonderful to do. And given everything I've learned about the Bhagavata's art history at this conference, I think I feel impelled to actually go and see. In fact, I think there's a nice painting, I mean very recent of course, but there's a beautiful painting of Urvashi and Pururava somewhere here as well.
You may have realized I'm an art historian in fact.
Yeah.
So, and this may be pertinent to what Dr. John as well spoke of. Mewari tradition, Rajasthani, none of them seem to speak of the Urvashi Pururava's narrative at all. So far, Guler or nowhere.
Yes.
It may be of interest to us. And if I may, one last question. Have you come across any women artists having been a part of the manuscript illuminations that you have studied at any point in time? The other speakers too? I leave it with this question since the chair asked me to make it short.
So I would not be qualified to answer that question, but the lady sitting just next to you would be perfectly suited to answer that question. So please ask Nirja as to whether that is the case or not. But thank you for pointing me in the direction of the paintings and the illuminations. I think one of the things I would be interested in looking at to continue a study of Urvashi and Pururavas is to see whether the Bhagavata's resurrection and reinterpretation of this story, maybe resurrection is not the right word because it never really died, but whether the Bhagavata's retelling of this story serves as, if it provides new life for Urvashi and Pururava in the vernacular traditions that are involved with the Bhagavata's long history or not, because you are right in that Urvashi and Pururavas fall off the map in many parts of India in terms of the vernacular tradition after being so important throughout the Sanskrit literature. So whether that is consistent throughout history or whether the Bhagavata has any role in bringing that story back to life, I would be very interested in seeing. So thank you for pointing that out.
So here, I think my task here ends. I thank the auditory for the question. I thank the three great scholars for your lecture, and I think here also I give the microphone to the next person.
Before we conclude this session, I invite our Professor Dr. G.J. Sudhakar to honor the speakers and the chairperson of this session by presenting a memento. Thank you, everyone. Now we break for tea.
Just a moment, Balaji.